Hello, and welcome to Replay Value. I remember seeing the trailer for R3 and feeling excited and nervous. Excited because Code Geass is one of my favorite anime ever, and the idea of seeing the cast back together was tantalizing. Nervous because Zero Requiem is basically the perfect ending for Lelouch's story, and the idea that something was to fall that might undo its greatness was unsettling. I try not to let later seasons or sequels spoil my appreciation for stories I enjoy, but in most cases, the subsequent material doesn't materially change its precursor. Think Psycho-Pass or Log Horizon. Season 2 is weaker in both cases, but nothing that happens there undermines the story of their original season. R3, by the nature of its existence, was going to eliminate the ambiguity of Lelouch's status at the end of Zero Requiem, something that I genuinely believe is thematically powerful to Code Geass's story. But we can tackle that another time. Thankfully, somewhere down the line, R3 became this movie, or was always intended as one. Frankly, still not sure what happened there, but none of the trailer footage I'm showing is in the final product, and became set in an alternate timeline where a certain character survived. So even in the worst case scenario, it'd be incredibly easy to compartmentalize this film. But that wasn't entirely necessary. While I wouldn't say that Resurrection was an improved end on Zero Requiem, I genuinely had a blast with the film in theaters, enjoyed my ruminations over the following days, and was pleased with my rewatch. I also never want to see another Code Geass story like it ever again. Code Geass Lelouch of the Resurrection is a fan service movie. I don't mean fan service in the normal way that it's used in discussions regarding anime, I mean it in the true sense of the word. This is a movie that is for the fans, and it will ignore the economy of storytelling in order to cram in as many fan-favorite characters, moments, and callbacks as possible. Hell, the timeline it takes place in brings back Shirley just for the childhood friend brigade. You've got Lelouch saying his catchphrase, characters crawling out of the woodwork for the big invasion despite the implausibility, Jeremiah showing up with oranges, Lelouch signaling to Suzaku with the collar, Cornelia wrecking shop, Cheese-kun getting some screen time. It feels like not a minute goes by without a reference of some kind to the original series. And listen, if you love Code Geass like I do, you're gonna enjoy all of that stuff immensely. It is so nice seeing the cast back together, operating in their usual pairs or in new ones that we never got in the TV show. My favorite part of the film was the prison breakout sequence because Lelouch, Collins, C2, Suzaku, Lloyd, and Sayako are that kind of mini squad that we never got in the original series, but who all work well together and have interesting personality mixes. It's awesome to watch Colin and Suzaku working together as nightmare pilots, and some of these visual effects, by the way, are an absolute treat. C's World gets a huge overhaul in terms of its visual language. In particular, the color usage is evocative of the ethereal, and there are some abstract sketch sequences that are terrifyingly beautiful. The whole movie looks and sounds good from a production perspective. There are plenty of throwbacks to the series soundtrack that'll make you nostalgic, and that's good. Really good. But it's a fan service movie, and the part of my brain that is not madly in love with the aesthetic trappings of Code Geass, but rather the soul, found this movie incredibly pointless. The plot is just a vehicle to get everyone relevant in the same spot and to briefly undo the era of peace that Zero Requiem necessarily brought about, which is to say that it's a broad story. There's basically only surface level engagement with any of those characters I love, their relationships, or its themes, either in relation to the original or novel concepts introduced here. It feels like this movie only exists so that Lelouch can do, well, Lelouch things. And don't get me wrong, those Lelouch things are great. It's no small part of why I fell in love with Code Geass. But outside of some extremely brief discussions between himself and C2, it's hard to say that any characters grew as a result of this film. The best example of the theming point is probably the quick two-line shared between Ogi and Tamaki right at the end of the film, where they ask themselves whether this governmental overthrow was the right thing to do. That is a really interesting idea, one that has direct connections to the OG with Britannia and Japan, but it's at the very end of the film as though to say, hey, isn't this an interesting thing for you to think about instead of for us to interrogate ourselves? Fundamentally, this adventure functions as a total tack-on that feels irrelevant to the themes of Code Geass, and the closest it gets, discussing regret, is more or less lost in the sauce to a degree where I'm confident most people walked out of the theater thinking there was no thematic throughline to the film. But it'd be hard to give anything proper due when the film is introducing 2 new Geass powers, a bunch of new nightmare frames, and trying to give even the non-combatants roles in the film. And I truly don't believe that any of this is out of malice or for lack of caring or trying. I think Shamna and Shalio have tons of potential to be fleshed out by a novelization or a manga adaptation, to really dive in on this concept of regret as a motivating force both for C2 and Shamna, placing them as strong foils within the story. Tons more to be done with Lelouch's resurrection itself. Basically, there is a solid chunk of story here, but the need to include as many characters as possible who are overwhelmingly irrelevant to the thematic points of the story make it a facsimile of what it could be. The best comparison for this dichotomy of what I enjoyed about this movie and what I disliked about this movie can best be described as the love the creators think the audience has for the story and the love that they themselves have for their story. It is my contention that Sunrise believed there is no audience for Code Geass without Lelouch. How else does one explain his ham-fisted inclusion in Akito, though that is certainly a conversation for another time, and several decisions made throughout this film are proof of that, like the fact that it exists at all. And while, as I've stated many times, I enjoyed much of the fan service on display in this film because I am very much the audience that this was aimed at, there was one moment that really got my goat. Towards the end of the film, while in C's world, Lelouch and Nunnally are consumed by the regrets that have built up in C's world. Charles and Marianne's, as well as Shamna's and dozens of other characters from the show's run. And when Lelouch is about to use Geass to force C's world to free them, he stops and acknowledges that Geass is the cause for all of his regrets. From killing people like Yuffie and countless others like Shirley's father, not to mention the emotional toll on the people he cares about, and that Nunnally does not need to bear his mistakes or actions that he took for her. Effectively, what he tried to say in the finale by being cruel. It is this moment of reflection on the use of his Geass that stops the plane's regrets from consuming them. And as hands catch them from the audience's point of view, Lelouch literally turns to the camera and says, Lelouch has broken the fourth wall in this moment and thanked the audience for saving his life, the fans who endlessly support this series and desperately want more Lelouch in their lives, to the point where their hopes resurrected him for this movie, literally. And sure, you can give an in-story explanation that it is the people like Yuffie and Rollo and everyone else who cares about Nunnally and Lelouch and have forgiven him in this moment, and that eased their regrets, serving as the antithesis of Zero Requiem. Literally his sins being forgiven and being returned to life, as opposed to him accepting the world's hatred and being struck down. And theoretically, I really like that. I just would have loved to have seen those people lifting Lelouch up instead of that incredibly blatant imagery of the audience being the only reason why Lelouch keeps getting trotted out when his story has been completed for quite a while. Maybe the creators are right and the audience only watches the new Code Geass properties for Lelouch, but in my case that is not true, and I found this one moment of fan service to be incredibly disheartening because of what it says about my hopes of getting Code Geass material without him. It is maybe unsurprising then that the moment I really loved from this film can be found with Colin in the opening half of the film. When Colin sees Lelouch for the first time, she simply has a look of horror on her face. And that makes sense. This is the man she loved, merely a husk of his former self, unable to recognize her, nor bearing any of the personality that so defines him. On the drive out to the prison, she can't even bear to look at him, holding her hand over her eye. She's entirely rejected that this shell is really Lelouch as she pulls out her purse knife, which is a great throwback, as though she's about to kill that which should be dead. She has tears in her eyes, questioning whether Lelouch even wanted to be brought back. But the most powerful moment has to be once they've arrived in front of the gate, where Lelouch's shell stares at her. Colin begins to get upset as though he's forgotten her, causing her to pull away from him. In that moment, Lelouch's body, even without the soul that shares all of their history together, comforts her, as though it remembers that this is someone he cares about, a muscle memory beyond his consciousness. And in that moment, Colin finally breaks down, recognizing this shell as the person she loves, thankful that he's still alive, and also heartbroken about his current state, painfully crying as Resurrection forces us to watch and listen. This sequence speaks to the strength of their relationship from the series, Colin's guard that even post-war she hasn't entirely put down, and the pain she's carried since Zero Requiem. This is conveyed almost entirely by the minutia in framing and animation, and yet it hits so hard because it's emotionally poignant. It speaks to the love that the creators have for their characters and their relationship and this world. The fact that they can make great moments even without Lelouch doing Lelouch things. That they care about their cast enough to make sure to include some damn good character storytelling like that, even tucked away in this fan service film. I realize that this is a pretty scattered video, and that you might be finishing it up unsure exactly how I feel about it. And hey, that's accurate for so much of what putting this video together was like for me. Because while the fan in me wants to just go, wasn't it sick when there was a time loop? And make a video about that, the student of storytelling in me feels like that lack of time spent on the loops was a missed opportunity. Side note, the pinned comment will link to a straw poll where you can vote on whether my next Code Geass video is about Resurrection's time loop, or the Akito films, or Resurrection's theme of regret. The reality is that I loved Resurrection because I'm an irrational fan when it comes to this series, and it'd been a long time since these characters did something new on screen. But frankly, this movie makes me nervous that future installments will similarly be focused on breadth instead of depth, and it won't have the charm of nostalgia on the next go-around. To be clear, I will not be happy if the next Code Geass installment is another fan service film, but in this instance, I'm willing to forgive it and go with the ride. And I think Colin's journey that I just outlined above is a great metaphor for my feelings on this film. That even though this movie is a mostly shallow husk that only briefly touches on so much of what I love about this franchise, it still touches on those things. And most importantly, it's still Code Geass.